a million were struck by this mysterious disease before it vanished, according to Jonathan Rogers from The Conversation. He said people have forgotten what life is all about. Robert De Niro's character says in the film Awakenings, after being revived from the shutdown state he had been in for 30 years, they've forgotten what it is to be alive. Based on the true story told by Dr. Oliver Sacks, Awakenings focuses with exquisite detail on the experiences of a few extraordinary people affected by a disease known as encephalitis lethargica, or the sleepy sickness. Yet far from being a rarity, this disease affected 1 million people worldwide during and after the First World War. And then it vanished and has remained a mystery for the past century. The question that has never been answered is, what caused it? The disease was first described by a neurologist in Vienna in 1917. It was noted that the initial symptoms were similar to those of flu, but that's where the similarities ended. Over the next few years, some would be unable to sleep at all, while others would be so drowsy they could be woken for only a few minutes to eat. About half died in this early phase, but those who survived were even more perplexing. After recovering, often returning to work, many started to notice stiffness, slowness in their movements, and even in that their eyes would get stuck in certain positions. Sadly, this slowly progressed, and many were left like De Niro's character in a frozen state, unable to speak or move. But that was not all. Many would develop monotonous and slurred speech. Some had changes in their mood, perceptions, and personality. In a study my colleagues and I conducted, we even came across 4 patients who developed kleptomania, that's compulsive stealing, as part of their illness. So what could have caused this? Finding the origin of the disease is not as straightforward as it sounds. HIV as a cause of AIDS or HPV causing cervical cancer were both long journeys and were not at all obvious early on. It's the same with encephalitis lethargica. And given that it started suddenly and then went away, some have suggested it might be related to an infection. Spanish flu occurred at the same time, although the first cases of encephalitis lethargica were earlier. We have not found any influenza virus in the brains of people who were affected, so it does not quite fit in a simple way. To look at what might be going on, we spent hours reading through the meticulously preserved records of more than 600 patients who had encephalitis lethargica. We found that only 32% of them had anything even remotely like flu in the year before their illness started, and less than 1% had an affected family member. So the flu infection story is not very convincing, at least on its own. And what about something in the environment? In 1917 it's a fairly eventful year, to say the least, with the First World War involving an enormous mobilization of people, arms, and supplies. Perhaps it was some new chemical being used, yet our study found no link to people who worked with particular substances. More recently, a new theory of encephalitis lethargica had been proposed. The idea is that there might be an autoimmune process involved, that is, the body's natural defense and mechanisms might have turned on itself and attacked the brain. This happens elsewhere in the body. A reaction against cells in the pancreas caused type 1 diabetes, while antibodies to cells in the thyroid gland can trigger Graves' disease. In the brain, the results can be devastating, and in recent years we have recognized that multiple sclerosis also results from a problem with the immune system. Something called autoimmune encephalitis is where certain antibodies attack nerve cells in the brain. We find that almost half of the patients diagnosed with encephalitis lethargica might have had autoimmune encephalitis, though it did not fit the pattern for any of the types we recognize today. How could this explain a disease that arose out of nowhere and caused such a range of symptoms? Some patients found that their movements and thoughts were massively slowed down. Others hallucinated, had bizarre delusions, or even seemed to lose their sense of right and wrong. This is where we may have to return to the idea of an infection, either flu or something else. Some autoimmune diseases can be triggered by an infection of some kind, which may look a bit like something the body is familiar with. It's a good disguise for the invading bug, but once your body has recognized it, there's a risk it turns the body's defense on itself. Does this really matter? Is it worth solving a pandemic where the last survivor died 2 decades ago? Well, sadly, encephalitis lethargica was not the first neurological epidemic of its kind, and if we don't crack it, we won't be prepared for the next one. And this is by Jonathan Rogers, Wellcome Trust Clinical Fellow in Psychiatry, UCL, from the conversation on Science Alert. Please leave your comments, and thank you for your support. Please support my Patreon account. The daily posts are 5 videos daily, and they are totally different from what I have on my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for your support and that you find all my content so interesting. You'll find the Patreon account details in the description box below.